Richard M. Nixon emerged victorious in the 1968 presidential election, vowing to bring about peace with honor in Vietnam. When he assumed office in January 1969, he tasked his administration with finding a way to pull back from the conflict. After extensive discussions, he revealed in June, during a conference with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, that the United States would start transferring the responsibility of the war to South Vietnamese forces, while gradually withdrawing American troops. This initiative became known as Vietnamization, aiming to enhance the capabilities of the South Vietnamese military so they could take on the fight independently as U.S. forces retreated. The first significant test of Vietnamization occurred in the spring of 1970, when Nixon authorized an incursion into North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. This operation involved 32,000 American soldiers and 48,000 South Vietnamese troops. The main assault in the Fish Hook region was executed by the 1st Cavalry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, while South Vietnamese forces targeted the Parrot's Beak region simultaneously. Both operations succeeded remarkably, leading Allied forces to discover and dismantle several large communist base camps, seizing a considerable amount of supplies and materials. During this mission, the South Vietnamese troops performed admirably with support from U.S. artillery, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships, completing all their assigned tasks. Nixon declared the South Vietnamese success in Cambodia to be visible proof of the success of Vietnamization. However, the Cambodian incursion had an unexpected consequence. Without its sanctuaries in Cambodia, Hanoi had to rely solely on cross-country routes through Laos for resupplying its forces in the south. To compensate for the lost Sihanoukville overland route and the substantial inventories seized by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces during the Cambodian offensive, the Communists launched a significant effort to enhance the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not just a simple road. It was a complicated network of trails, bike paths, and roads, some able to support heavy trucks, tanks, and armored personnel carriers, along with base camps and storage facilities. By 1971, this system extended from North Vietnam through the Mu Gia, Ban Karai, and Ban Raving passes in the Annamite Mountains to Chepone and Muang Nong in Laos, right across the border from Khe San in Quang Tri Province. From two major base areas in this region, known as 604 and 611, the Ho Chi Minh Trail headed south towards other base areas along South Vietnam's 1,300-kilometer border with Laos and Cambodia. After the war, the North Vietnamese proudly claimed they constructed over 13,000 kilometers of trails and roads as part of this network, maintained and defended by Transportation Group 559, which relied on around 100,000 NVA and Laotian volunteers and laborers. U.S. intelligence estimated that between 1966 and 1971, approximately 630,000 NVA troops, 100,000 tons of food, 400,000 weapons, and 50,000 tons of ammunition traveled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam. Following the Allied invasion of Cambodia, the NVA took further actions to enhance and protect the trail, ensuring it could be used without interference from U.S. or South Vietnamese forces. In the fall of 1970, 20 anti-aircraft battalions were deployed into Laos to shield the trail from aerial attacks. These new units were equipped with a variety of advanced weaponry, including machine guns and anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, significantly strengthening the air defense over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Along with the air defense units, additional NVA combat divisions also moved into Laos to safeguard this crucial supply route, raising the total communist presence in Laos to an estimated 22,000 troops, consisting of 7,000 NVA combat troops, 10,000 logistics and support personnel, and 5,000 communist Pathet Lao, all coordinated under a new command, the 70B Corps, which oversaw the 304th, 308th, and 320th NVA divisions. With these forces in place, intelligence reports indicated that by late 1970, the NVA was sending about 6,000 combat troops through Laos down the trail into South Vietnam each month. Alongside reports of heightened infiltration, U.S. intelligence noted significant stockpiling of weapons, ammunition, and equipment at Base Area 604 near Chapone. The intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese were also focused on restoring their sanctuaries in Cambodia. President Nixon and his military advisors were deeply concerned about the escalating situation in Laos and the renewed activities in Cambodia. If no action was taken, the North Vietnamese could soon pose a direct threat to Quang Tri, the northernmost province in South Vietnam. A swift march from Base Area 611 through the A Shau Valley could enable them to launch an attack on the ancient city of Hue. Intelligence analysts believed that the influx of troops and new weaponry in Laos and Cambodia might be paving the way for a communist offensive against the northern provinces of South Vietnam, either early in 1971 or, more likely, during the 1972 U.S. election year, when fewer than 50,000 U.S. troops would still be in South Vietnam and Nixon would be focusing on his re-election campaign. The president was confronted with a dilemma similar to the one he faced when communists threatened Phnom Penh. He had to act against the North Vietnamese presence in Laos or risk a significant impact on Vietnamization and the U.S. withdrawal plans from Southeast Asia. He couldn't afford to delay taking action in Laos, as U.S. strength and combat power were diminishing daily, and he doubted the South Vietnamese could manage the situation alone. After reviewing a series of studies he commissioned in November 1970, Nixon determined that his only option was to initiate a preemptive strike against the communists. The challenge was to decide where to direct the attack. Initially, an amphibious assault into North Vietnam targeting Vinh was considered, but Kissinger suggested instead to replicate the Cambodian incursion to leverage the advantages gained from the earlier operation. Nixon dispatched General Alexander Haig to Saigon to consult with General Creighton Abrams, the commander of MAP-V, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, and South Vietnamese President Thio. During their discussions, they all concurred with Kissinger's assessment that a new Allied offensive was urgently needed. General Abrams proposed an offensive plan. An ambitious operation was set in motion, featuring a primary attack into Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, along with a secondary strike into Cambodia. Abrams believed that if the communist supply lines could be disrupted in Laos and Cambodia for just one dry season, it would severely limit, if not completely eliminate, their capability to launch a large-scale offensive in South Vietnam for the foreseeable future. Consequently, he proposed that U.S. forces establish blocking positions along the demilitarized zone and set up a forward support base near the border. This would assist South Vietnamese forces in executing an attack into Laos to capture Chapone. Following this initial strike, search and clear operations would be carried out to dismantle communist strongholds and disrupt traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Additionally, a smaller operation into Cambodia aimed to target a new enemy base being developed near the Chup rubber plantation in Military Region 3. Haig returned to Washington and shared Abrams's plan with Kissinger and the president. According to Kissinger, Nixon immediately approved the plan, but was determined not to be caught off guard by critics as he had been the previous year concerning Cambodia. Thus, he began to cultivate a consensus for the offensive among his advisors, organizing a series of meetings where he could discuss the plan with key advisors and cabinet members individually. On December 23rd, Haig updated Nixon once more, this time with Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird in attendance. After the briefing, Nixon expressed his support for the operation and asked Laird to investigate the plan during his upcoming visit to Saigon in early January. Laird, according to Kissinger, endorsed the idea of a cross-border operation aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, arguing that it would provide at least a year's worth of advantage, and a successful major offensive by the South Vietnamese, independent of U.S. ground support, would demonstrate the effectiveness of Vietnamization. On December 21, 1970, Nixon approved the Laos operation in principle, pending final review before execution. Shortly afterward, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized General Abrams to coordinate with General Vien, the chief of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, and undertake any planning necessary for the Laos operation. A subsequent message directed Abrams to prepare contingency plans for a South Vietnamese cross-border initiative as he had proposed to Haig. The operation into Laos via Route 9, just south of the DMZ, would be supported by American air and naval forces, along with a simultaneous South Vietnamese assault into Cambodia aimed at dismantling a significant enemy base being established in the Chup rubber plantation. Due to the Cooper Church Amendment, which was enacted following the Cambodian incursion, American ground troops were prohibited from crossing into Laos, and advisors could not accompany ARVN units during the offensive. U.S. support would be restricted to air support, helicopters, and long-range artillery from South Vietnamese fire bases on the border. Nevertheless, the president was confident in the ARVN's ability to carry out these operations in conjunction with the American combat forces that were present at the start of 1971. Admiral Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, assured him that the South Vietnamese would succeed with the backing of American air power. The South Vietnamese also shared this confidence. General Abrams briefed President Chio and the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff in early December, reporting that Chio responded positively and believed the operation should proceed. While Matt CV developed contingency plans, Nixon and his advisors continued to deliberate over the proposed operations. After Laird returned from Saigon, the president convened a meeting in the Oval Office on January 18, 1971, with Kissinger, Laird, Haig, Moore, Secretary of State William Rogers, and Richard Helms, the director of the CIA. Laird shared insights from his discussions with Abrams, Bunker, and Chiu. In nearly 3 hours of briefing, he outlined the military and political landscape in South Vietnam and then delved into the strategies for Laos and Cambodia. The group reached a consensus that, if successful, the campaign could disrupt the North Vietnamese buildup and postpone any planned communist offensive, buying at least 6 additional months for the Vietnamization program to advance and allowing for the continued withdrawal of U.S. troops. Nixon believed that a triumphant operation might persuade the communists to negotiate sincerely and emphasized that these actions could be crucial to the war's overall trajectory. A significant point in the discussions was, as Admiral Moore mentioned in an earlier memo to Laird, that this operation marked the final chance for the South Vietnamese to launch a major offensive against the enemy's strongholds while American forces were still robust enough to offer support. Haig later noted that those briefing the president on this plan felt optimistic about its success, but all agreed that the vital element was comprehensive U.S. military backing for the ARVN. This highlights the dominant mindset regarding the Vietnamization process. However, as General Haig recalled in his memoirs, the success of Vietnamization didn't hinge on its military effectiveness. Instead, its success was realized not in Vietnam, but in the U.S., where, as Secretary of Defense Laird and his team had hoped, it diminished opposition to the war in Congress and the media by proposing a program that promised a clear end to American casualties. Yet fewer American casualties had little bearing on the military capability of South Vietnam's forces. Nonetheless, Nixon tentatively approved moving forward with detailed planning for the cross-border operation into Laos, dubbed Lam Son 719. As military plans progressed, Kissinger began to harbor doubts about the operation. On January 25th, he met with Admiral Moore. Kissinger argued that if the Chapon area was so crucial to the North Vietnamese supply lines, they would surely fight fiercely to hold it. Worried about the potential for significant South Vietnamese losses, he questioned whether the ARVN could operate effectively without U.S. advisors and air controllers on site. Moore reassured him that the South Vietnamese were up to the task and that U.S. air power could contain the battlefield to maintain manageable force ratios. Kissinger documented his discussions with Moore in a memo to the president and arranged for Moore to meet Nixon the following day. When Moore spoke with the president, he was firm in his reassurances, asserting that the operation was solid and that decisive outcomes were likely. While Nixon was persuaded by these forecasts, Secretary of State Rogers remained skeptical. In a meeting on January 29th, he urged the president to reconsider, to reevaluate his choice, claiming that the operation carried excessive risk. He pointed out that when General Westmoreland was in charge, he had assessed that a similar mission would require 4 U.S. divisions. The current proposal was to involve significantly fewer South Vietnamese forces. Thus, to Rogers, a defeat for the ARVN seemed inevitable, and he feared that it could cause irreversible harm to the Vietnamization initiative. Moreover, he suspected that Nixon's critics in Congress would argue that the operation went against the spirit, if not the actual terms, of the Cooper Church Amendment. Kissinger noted that Nixon had already considered most of Rogers' concerns and believed the Secretary of State simply didn't understand the situation. The president directed that the operation move forward, and on February 4, 1971, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued the official command. LAM-SON 719 was set to be a joint RVF-US operation conducted under specific limitations. There was no unified command for oversight of the mission. The overall ground commander for the operation in Laos was Lieutenant Gen Hong Xuan Lam, who led the ARVN's I Corps. His American counterpart, Lieutenant Gen James W. Sutherland from 14th Corps, would oversee all U.S. Army troops involved and coordinate American support. Gen Lucius D. Clay, Jr., leader of the 7th Air Force, would manage and align all U.S. Air Force resources for the mission. The campaign aimed to be a spoiling attack, not focused on capturing and holding territory, but rather on disrupting the enemy's plans and preventing a new offensive. The goal of Operation LAM-SON 719 was to seize Base Area 604 in the Chapon region, strategically located at a key crossroads of supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, about 30 miles from the South Vietnamese border. Once Tichapon was secured, the South Vietnamese forces would disrupt the trail and eliminate logistical sites in the area for the remainder of the dry season. The actual invasion of Laos was scheduled to start on February 8th and continue for 90 days until the onset of the monsoon rains would limit operations. The assault would be carried out by some of the ARVN's elite troops, including the ARVN 1st Division, 1st Armored Brigade, 3 Ranger battalions from I Corps, and most of the elite airborne and marine divisions from the Joint General Staff's Strategic Reserve were set to play a key role. At the start, 16,000 South Vietnamese troops would launch the operation, with reinforcements later bringing the total to 20,000. In support of this effort, around 10,000 U.S. combat, engineering, and support troops would operate from Quang Tri Province. The operation was structured in 4 phases. In Phase 1, the 1st Brigade of the U.S. 5th Infantry Division aimed to clear and secure Route 9 from Dong Ha to the Laotian border, while also securing Fire Support Base Vandegrift, an abandoned U.S. Marine fire base, and Khe Sanh, where a headquarters would coordinate helicopter assaults, close air support, long-range artillery fires, and logistical tasks. The U.S. 45th Engineer Group was responsible for repairing the airfield at Khe Sanh for C-130 operations and fixing Route 9 leading to the Laotian border. While the 1st Brigade was in action, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division would take control of the area previously held by the ARVN 1st Infantry Division in Quang Tri and Toi Tien provinces as the ARVN moved into Laos. Other U.S. forces were tasked with securing the area south of the DMZ and along the Vietnamese-Laotian border. An ARVN task force from the 1st Armored Brigade was designated to follow the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division, moving northwest after Khe Sanh was secured to protect the northern flank. The U.S. component of Phase 1 was codenamed Dewey Canyon 2. During this phase, 6,500 troops from the ARVN 1st Airborne Division and 3,000 from the Vietnamese Marine Corps were to be positioned in the I Corps region, transported by U.S. Air Force cargo planes to airfields at Quang Tri and Dong Ha. The entire Phase 1 was anticipated to take 5 to 8 days to complete. Once U.S. forces secured Route 9 in South Vietnam, South Vietnamese troops planned to occupy assembly areas and attack positions just short of the Laotian border near Khe Sanh and Lao Bao. Phase 2 would kick off with a 3-pronged ARVN attack moving west along the highway to Chapon, bolstered by close air support from the 7th U.S. Air Force and U.S. 14 Corps helicopters along with long-range artillery. The primary assault along the highway would be executed by the ARVN Airborne Division, strengthened by the 1st Armored Brigade. The movement involved successive helicopter assaults, ultimately targeting the capture of Aloi, where routes 9 and 92 converge. Once the initial goal was secured, the Airborne Division would launch an air assault into Chapon, while ground forces advanced by road to join the airborne troops there. To safeguard the main attack, the South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division was tasked with a parallel operation in the south to establish firing bases on elevated terrain along Route 9 between Alui and Chapone. In the north, the South Vietnamese 1st Ranger Group would conduct helicopter assaults to set up blocking positions, preventing enemy forces from moving south and obstructing the main advance along the highway. The attack helicopters from the U.S. 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry Air, were assigned to locate and neutralize anti-aircraft weapons, identify enemy concentrations, and conduct reconnaissance and security missions, which included rescuing aircrews downed in Laos. A Vietnamese Marine Brigade would remain in reserve at Khe Sanh. 2 days before Phase 2 commenced, U.S. tactical air operations were set to begin an intensive campaign aimed at suppressing enemy air defenses, lasting between 3 to 7 days. Phase 3, beginning after the capture of Chapone, involved the South Vietnamese conducting search and destroy missions in Base Area 6004 and the surrounding regions south of Chapone. The 1st Airborne Division would establish blocking positions northwest of Chapone along Route 91 and southeast along Route 9 to isolate the area. Concurrently, the 1st Infantry Division was tasked with search and destroy operations in its designated area just south of the Zipan River, while the 1st Ranger Group continued its blocking and screening efforts on the northern flank. The ARVN forces were restricted to a corridor no wider than 15 miles on either side of Route 9 and could not penetrate deeper than Chapone. Phase 4, the conclusive phase, focused on the withdrawal of South Vietnamese forces from Laos. This would occur in one of 2 ways, depending on the circumstances at the time. The first option entailed the Airborne Division withdrawing directly east along Route 9 to support a southeast attack into Base Area 6111 by the 1st Infantry Division while making their way back into South Vietnam. The second option involved an attack by both divisions into Base Area 611. Both choices included plans for RVNF elements to remain behind, harassing the enemy in base areas 604 and 611 after the main troop withdrawal by South Vietnam. The strategy also featured a deception phase. To mislead the North Vietnamese about the primary assault, a naval task force with U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Amphibious Unit and 2 aircraft carriers would position itself in the Tonkin Gulf, around 70 kilometers from Vinh, a port city in North Vietnam. This task force's mission was to simulate an amphibious landing on Vinh, drawing North Vietnamese focus away as South Vietnamese forces moved into Laos. This aspect of the plan was successful, as the amphibious task force did capture the attention of the North Vietnamese High Command, allowing South Vietnamese forces a few days of relief from major NVA reinforcements in Laos. It was thought that communist espionage cells were operating within the RVNAF High Command. As a result, Abrams instructed that only a minimal number of personnel be involved in the joint planning for the operation. Units set to participate were not informed until January 17th, and the Airborne Division, designated to lead the assault, received detailed plans only on February 2nd, less than a week before the scheduled D-Day on February 8th. Even with these precautions, there were later signs that NVA agents had infiltrated the I Corps staff and obtained detailed plans for the operation. To avoid early media coverage of the operation, MassTV briefed American reporters off the record about the upcoming campaign and then imposed a temporary embargo on reporting troop movements until the operation commenced. This decision backfired, as the embargo itself suggested an imminent operation. Although the embargo was lifted on February 4th, news had already leaked, leading to speculative stories in both U.S. and international newspapers about a forthcoming Allied attack into Laos. Despite the challenges in keeping the operation under wraps, U.S. and ARVN commanders maintained a strong optimism about the ambitious plan's potential outcome. Colonel Arthur W. Pence, the senior advisor, was among them. The ARVN Airborne Division reported following the operation that it was clear at this point that intelligence believed the operation would face minimal opposition. They anticipated that a 2-day preparation of the area before D-Day, using tactical air, would effectively neutralize the enemy's anti-aircraft capabilities. despite the enemy reportedly having between 170 and 200 anti-aircraft weapons of varying types in the area. The threat from tanks was thought to be minor, and the ability to reinforce was estimated to take 14 days for 2 divisions from north of the DMZ. Both U.S. and ARVN commanders were seemingly encouraged by the limited success of the Cambodian incursion. However, there were 3 key differences between the operation in Laos and the Cambodian incursion that significantly influenced the outcome of Lam Son 719. Although this was to be a combined effort with the XOT 14th U.S. Corps providing logistical support, long-range artillery, and helicopters, American personnel were barred from ground operations in Laos. This meant that, unlike in Cambodia, there would be no U.S. combat troops accompanying ARVN forces, and no American advisors would accompany the South Vietnamese into Laos. The ARVN had grown reliant on their advisors to coordinate U.S. resources, making this the first occasion that most of their troops would face battle without their American counterparts. Once they entered Laos, the South Vietnamese forces would have to fend for themselves against the NVA. The second notable difference between the Laotian operation and the Cambodian incursion involved the terrain and, to a large degree, the weather, both of which would significantly impact the battle's outcome. While the terrain in Cambodia was relatively manageable, the objective area for Lam Son 719 was rugged, filled with dense underbrush, and lined along the Exipon River, situated parallel to Route 9 to the south, by thick jungle. Route 9 itself was an unimproved road, often no better than a cart path in many areas. The highway was flanked by high ground on both sides, offering excellent defensive positions for the NVA. Weather was also a crucial factor. By the time of the operation, the northeast monsoon would just be tapering off, leading to marginal flying conditions that could often restrict helicopter and fixed-wing flight operations. The operation faced sporadic rainfall, sometimes heavy enough to hinder armored vehicle movement, making the terrain and weather unfavorable for the attacker. A significant difference between Lam Son 719 and the Cambodian operation was that, contrary to intelligence predictions, the enemy chose to stay and fight this time. It later emerged that the North Vietnamese army had anticipated an ARVN offensive into Laos near military region funds and had begun preparations as early as October 1970. They constructed defensive fortifications, set up ambush sites, pre-registered artillery strikes on likely Allied landing zones, and repositioned supplies and ammunition. By the time the ARVN launched their operation, over 22,000 NVA troops were in the vicinity of Chapone. Hanoi had ordered that Base Area 604 be defended and sent additional reinforcements, raising the enemy troop strength in the area to more than 36,000. By the campaign's end, the North Vietnamese were ready to deploy forces from 5 divisions, supported by armor and artillery. General Bruce Palmer noted that General Abrams was acutely aware of the risks stemming from the differences between the Cambodian incursion and Lam Son 719. It could have seemed like sending a boy to tackle a man's job in a highly hostile environment, but the U.S. commander relied heavily on B-52 airstrikes, U.S. tactical air support fires, and the tactical mobility provided by assault helicopters, along with their armed escorts, to level the playing field for the South Vietnamese. Palmer later referred to the situation as a big gamble. A failure could seriously undermine Vietnamization and might either extend the stay of U.S. forces in Vietnam or create domestic pressure to abandon South Vietnam. Success, however, would bolster the South Vietnamese forces and affirm the Vietnamization process, while any misstep could spell disaster for both South Vietnam and the United States. Phase 1 of the operation commenced with U.S. forces on January 29th at 4 a.m. The 1st Brigade, 5th U.S. Mechanized Infantry Division began clearing from Route 9 north toward the DMZ. Additional U.S. forces reoccupied the firebase at Khe San. The 45th Engineers started to repair the damaged airstrip. Simultaneously, more American troops secured Route 9 to the border and began patching up the road. By February 5th, U.S. forces had completed most of their assignments and took over security for the ARVN assembly areas near the border. The leading ARVN forces, which included the 1st Armor Brigade along with 2 South Vietnamese airborne battalions and the 11th and 17th Cavalry Regiments, crossed the line of departure as planned at 700 on February 8, 1971. Unfortunately, bad weather set in on February 6th, forcing the cancellation of airstrikes intended to neutralize NVA anti-aircraft guns along Route 9. Still, the 4,000-man armored column advanced west along the route as intended. Led by M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, they pushed 9 kilometers into Laos on the first day, but their progress was hindered by thick jungle and large bomb craters beside the route. The road itself was in poor condition, and the ARVN 101st Combat Engineer Battalion had to create detours where the road was completely destroyed, further delaying the armored column. Meanwhile, airborne forces on the northern flank captured their first objectives amid sporadic enemy resistance. The ARVN 1st Infantry Division on the southern flank also took their initial objectives with minimal enemy contact. It was later revealed that General Vo Nguyen Giap and the commander of the 70B Corps were holding back their forces until they could determine whether the ARVN's attack along Route 9 was genuine or just a feint to disguise a larger assault elsewhere. By February 9th, they concluded that this attack was indeed the main one, and the 70B Corps commander ordered the 308th Iron Division, positioned near the DMZ, to move towards Route 9 to bolster the NVA units already there. Additionally, the North Vietnamese High Command directed the 2nd NVA Division to relocate from further south to the Chepone area to counter the ARVN armored column on Route 9. Heavy rains turned Route 9 into a muddy mess, complicating the advance of the South Vietnamese armored column. Nevertheless, by February 10th, the attackers reached their first objective, Aloi, and connected with an airborne battalion airlifted in earlier that day by U.S. helicopters. The main South Vietnamese assault along the road had reached a point halfway to Chipone, facing only minor sniper fire from the enemy. Meanwhile, ARVN forces on both the northern and southern flanks moved in on positions near Aloi. In the north, the 3rd Airborne Brigade set up 2 fire bases, while the 21st and 39th Ranger Battalions established 2 outposts to provide early warning of any NVA reinforcements coming south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This created a network of 4 supportive bases in the northern region. Simultaneously, the ARVN 1st Infantry Division set up 5 fire bases south of Route 9 to defend that flank against enemy assaults. Up to this point, the South Vietnamese had made significant strides against relatively light NVA resistance. However, on February 11th, the offensive abruptly stalled. For reasons that were baffling at the time, the ARVN forces simply stopped their advance. This pause allowed the North Vietnamese to bring in additional reinforcements. There were already elements of 3 infantry regiments, a tank battalion, and an artillery unit in the vicinity, and the NVA High Command ordered 4 more infantry regiments and part of a tank regiment to join the fight. As these forces converged, the South Vietnamese remained inactive. It became clear that the ARVN needed to regain momentum before the enemy seized the initiative, but Lieutenant General Lam and his senior commanders said nothing. Without clear orders, the South Vietnamese troops in Laos stayed put. General Abrams was furious and went to speak with General Cao Van Vien, the chairman of the Joint General Staff, in Saigon to persuade him to spur the attackers into action. On February 16th, Abrams and Sutherland met with Vien and Lam at Lam's command post in Dong Ha. During this meeting, they decided to relocate the 1st ARVN Division further west along the southern escarpment to establish fire support bases for the resumption of the airborne armored advance westward along Route 9 to Chipone. It was estimated that it would take 3 to 5 days for the 1st Division elements to reach their new positions. The order was given, but unfortunately for the attackers, by this time, the NVA had already positioned reinforcements to block any resurgence of the South Vietnamese offensive. The ARVN lost the initiative and never regained it throughout the battle. After the operation, it became clear that President Chiu influenced the halt of the ARVN's advance. On February 12th, he warned Lam to be cautious as he moved west and advised him to call off the mission if they suffered 3,000 casualties. Chiu seemed to be concerned that high casualty rates in Laos could negatively affect the upcoming national elections in the fall. He was also worried about depleting the ARVN General Reserve, which included the Airborne Division, the 1st Armored Brigade, and the South Vietnamese Marines. More importantly, these forces acted as Thieu's protective measure against any potential coup, making him hesitant to risk their destruction. Regardless of his reasons, his order effectively ensured that the attack would stall, as ARVN commanders shifted their focus from advancing to minimizing casualties. When the momentum was lost, restarting the attack became nearly impossible. As the South Vietnamese forces found themselves stalled along the road, new NVA reinforcements were brought into the battle area. On February 18th, the 308th NVA Division was spotted on the northern flank for the first time. The 2nd NVA Division moved in front of the leading ARVN units, while the 24B Regiment of the 305th NVA Division was identified south of Route 9. To make matters worse, ARVN forces began seeing enemy tanks, and an NVA prisoner confirmed there was a tank regiment in the vicinity. By early March, North Vietnamese troops outnumbered their South Vietnamese counterparts 2-1. Heavy mortar and large-caliber artillery fire intensified against all South Vietnamese positions, catching the would-be attackers off guard as they faced a much stronger enemy than expected. Compounding the South Vietnamese challenges, intermittent rain and thick fog frequently grounded all aircraft. The few helicopters that managed to fly had to operate at low altitudes, leaving them highly vulnerable to enemy fire. Resupplying the ARVN assault became especially difficult and dangerous under these conditions. On February 19th, Lam and his division commanders met with President Thieu, where Lam briefed him on the situation, emphasizing the enemy sightings. New North Vietnamese Army units were active in the area. Thieu instructed Lam to take his time and expand search efforts to the southwest. This was an empty directive that essentially told Lam to continue what he was doing, which was effectively nothing. By February 20th, the South Vietnamese had completely lost their momentum. Armed with Soviet-made T-54 and PT-76 tanks and heavy artillery, the NVA launched intense, repeated frontal assaults against ARVN positions, especially targeting the airborne and ranger units stationed on the northern flank. Almost every South Vietnamese unit soon found itself engaged in heavy combat with the enemy. The NVA employed tactics that involved surrounding ARVN positions and cutting off their aerial resupply lines with heavy anti-aircraft fire, all while relentlessly bombarding them with mortar, rocket, and artillery fire. They would then storm the positions, coordinating infantry and armor assaults wherever possible. Although the ARVN fought back, they were often outnumbered and struggled to effectively coordinate maneuvers and artillery support. Moreover, their artillery had a significantly shorter range than the NVA's 130mm and 122mm guns, which hindered their ability to return fire effectively. Therefore, the South Vietnamese relied heavily on U.S. close air support and attack helicopters for survival. Unfortunately, the Allied air support fell short of expectations for various reasons. First, poor weather often grounded helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, or degraded their performance when they could fly. Additionally, with no U.S. advisors present, the airstrikes that did occur were poorly coordinated. To complicate matters further, the enemy's air defense system was much more robust and effective than intelligence analysts had predicted. The NVA quickly realized they could reduce the impact of U.S. tactical air support by staying close to ARVN positions, making it difficult for American fighter bombers and attack helicopters to engage without endangering their South Vietnamese allies. B-52 Arc-Light bombing missions proved to be effective, but only when the NVA concentrated their forces for an assault. With elements from 4 divisions, the NVA ramped up the intensity of their attacks on South Vietnamese positions. They had isolated the 39th Ranger Battalion at Ranger Base North on February 19th, surrounding the base with over 2,000 troops. Over the course of 3 intense days, the North Vietnamese Army relentlessly bombarded the position and chased the Rangers as they tried to escape. Out of the 430 Rangers who were present at the battle's commencement, 178 were either killed or missing, and 148 sustained injuries. The 39th Battalion was effectively finished as a combat unit, but they had inflicted significant casualties on the enemy, Reconnaissance analysts later tallied 639 NVA bodies strewn across the area around Ranger Base North. The North Vietnamese then focused their efforts on Ranger Base South, home to the 21st Battalion and the remaining forces of the 39th Battalion. After 2 days of fierce combat, Lieutenant General Lam concluded that the Rangers' position was no longer sustainable and directed the South Vietnamese defenders to retreat to Fire Support Base 30. This decision rendered another Ranger Battalion combat ineffective and deeply eroded the morale of the survivors. One significant detail from the battle at Ranger Base North shaped the long-lasting public perception of Lam Son 719. Though the majority of the Rangers fought bravely, a small number of uninjured soldiers panicked and attempted to board helicopters that were evacuating critically wounded troops. The air crews worked to stop these soldiers from abandoning the fight, yet some managed to cling to the helicopter's skids, making their way back to South Vietnam. Images of these individuals desperately hanging on became the defining visual of Operation Lam Son 719. This portrayal sparked a wave of protests among Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Robert F. Molinelli, the commander of the 2nd Squadron, 17th Air Cavalry, who provided support during the battle at Ranger Base North, asserted, "The ARVN Rangers faced a 6 or 8 to 1 disadvantage. For 3 days, we couldn't get supplies to them. When they ran low on ammunition, they took NVA rifles and continued to fight. When they decided to leave their hill, they fought their way right through that North Vietnamese regiment, using the enemy's own guns against them. 17 of their men did panic and left by clinging to helicopter skids, but many more did not." Despite these defenses, it became nearly impossible to alter the early narrative presented by the media, showcasing panic-stricken ARVN soldiers fleeing from the communists. Amidst these developments, President Thieu's discontent with Lieutenant General Lam's indecision and mishandling of the battle grew increasingly pronounced. On February 23rd, he called for Lieutenant General Do Cao Tri, celebrated for his role in the Cambodian incursion, was moved from his 3-Corps headquarters to Saigon, where he handed over command of Lam Son 719 to the more energetic Tri. Unfortunately, on his way to his new position, Tri's helicopter crashed, resulting in his death. Lieutenant General Lam continued to oversee the operation in Laos. The pressure from the North Vietnamese army didn't ease. On February 25th, they overwhelmed the 3rd Airborne Brigade at Fire Support Base 31, capturing Colonel Nguyen Van Tho and his entire staff. A South Vietnamese counterattack was launched but was unsuccessful, though it did take out 250 North Vietnamese and destroyed 11 PT-76 and T-54 tanks. During the defense of FSB 31 and the following counterattack, the ARVN airborne forces faced heavy losses, with 155 killed and over 100 taken prisoner. Soon after, the NVA targeted Fire Support Base 30, repeating a troubling pattern. Lieutenant General Sutherland conveyed his concerns to General Abrams in a message. "I'm really worried about the discipline and morale within the airborne division." Lieutenant General Dong, the division commander, has developed a defeatist attitude, which is echoed by some of his subordinates. "Today we planned and executed an operation to resupply FSB 30, evacuate the dead and wounded, and transport some 21st Rangers to the Ranger FSB. While we managed to evacuate the wounded and 4 bodies, 94 healthy troops, not counting all the Rangers, hurried to the helicopters. The airborne infantry commander was among those who made it aboard. I've heard, though it remains unconfirmed, that the brigade commander arrived at about 1800 hours to take charge of the situation. I fear that before the night is over, the airborne troops may abandon FSB 30. The South Vietnamese forces didn't leave the fire support base right away, but it only held out for a few more days. Eventually, the base's artillery sustained damage and the 2nd Airborne Battalion received orders to evacuate. On February 28th, President Thieu intervened once again. He determined that the mission of Lam Son 719 should pivot from destroying the NVA base to taking Chapone, a target that held little military importance on its own. Concentrating on Chapone was primarily a public relations strategy, which, if successful, would allow Thieu to proclaim a victory and move his forces to safety, gaining political leverage for the fall elections ahead. he instructed the Airborne Division to be replaced by the remaining units of the Marine Division, which had been relocated to Khe Sanh. This decision was absurd. The Airborne Division, while engaged in combat, was still in relatively decent condition, and no justifiable reason was given for their replacement. Additionally, the Marine Division had never operated as a cohesive unit and was an untested variable. To complicate matters, swapping one division for another amid intense enemy resistance is one of the toughest challenges in modern warfare. Lieutenant General Lam recognized this reality and traveled to Saigon to propose an alternative strategy. He suggested to Teo that the 1st ARVN Infantry Division, reinforced with its 2nd Regiment moved from near the DMZ, should launch a helicopter assault into Chepone. The Marine Division would follow the 1st Division, while the Airborne Division would be tasked with securing the northern flank. Theo agreed, and the next day, on March 1st, he informed Abrams and Ambassador Bunker about this new directive. Abrams was displeased with this turn of events. He felt that the goal of occupying and destroying enemy base areas in Laos was abandoned in favor of what he viewed as a politically motivated initiative to deploy South Vietnamese forces into Chepone, rather than for sound military reasons. However, Abrams had no choice but to accept Teo's decision. The NVA had taken control of the high ground overlooking Route 9 from the north, but it came at a steep cost. Frequent B-52 strikes inflicted heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese, with MAC-CV estimating that they were losing one combat-effective regiment a week. This likely hindered the NVA's ability to gather sufficient forces to completely destroy ARVN units along the highway. From March 3rd to 6th, elements of the 1st ARVN Division carried out a series of helicopter assaults westward along the southern escarpment, setting up 3 bases named Lolo, Liz, and Sophia. NVA resistance to the 1st Division's advances was fierce. 11 helicopters were shot down and 44 others were damaged while bringing ARVN troops to fire support base Lolo. On March 6th, following intense bombardment of NVA positions by fighter bombers and B-52s, 2 infantry battalions from the 2nd Regiment, the 1st ARVN Division was airlifted by 120 U.S. UH-1 Huey helicopters from Khe Sanh to LZ Hope, located 4 kilometers northeast of Chepone. On March 7th, South Vietnamese troops entered Chepone. The ARVN had achieved their goal, but by then, the NVA forces had bolstered their numbers to 12 infantry regiments, 2 tank battalions, an artillery regiment, and at least 19 anti-aircraft battalions. The South Vietnamese troops in Laos found themselves in a dire situation. On March 9th, Lam flew once more to meet with Thieu and the Joint General Staff. His purpose this time was to advocate for the immediate withdrawal of his forces from Laos. He highlighted the vulnerable position of the ARVN forces and proposed to extract them via helicopter, starting with the 1st Division, the most western unit, followed by the airborne troops, and finally the Marines. General Vienne concurred with Lam. However, Abrams and Ambassador Bunker, present at the meeting, were strongly opposed to the withdrawal. They urged President Thieu to bolster his trapped forces in Laos with the ARVN 2nd Infantry Division, stationed in Quang Ngai Province, and to fight until the end against the Communists. Abrams and Bunker emphasized the importance of political and public relations implications. Abrams detailed his objections to the withdrawal in a message to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, mentioning concerns over how it might seem that RVNF forces had been compelled to retreat despite inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. The press reactions in South Vietnam, the United States, and internationally, and the potential impact on the political landscape in South Vietnam, especially with national elections approaching in the fall. Nevertheless, Thieu was hesitant to risk further casualties and the possible loss of his strongest division, the Airborne Division, along with most of his strategic reserve. Therefore, he ordered the operation to cease and for the withdrawal to commence. General Davidson, who was MAC-VJ-2 at the time, noted that Abrams privately remarked Thieu had lost his resolve and never truly forgave him. Lam began the withdrawal of his forces on March 12th, a challenging operation for a force engaged with and outnumbered by the enemy. By that time, the NVA had deployed 5 divisions to the area, aiming to cause as much damage to the ARVN as possible. Heavy anti-aircraft fire rained down on the evacuation helicopters, ambushing ARVN units on the road and keeping pressure on the South Vietnamese fire bases. The retreat stretched over 12 days and was nearly disastrous. The NVA tried to encircle and wipe out the South Vietnamese forces, and it was only U.S. tactical air support and attack helicopters that prevented a complete collapse. The airborne and armored troops pulled back along Route 9, while the units on the sides were extracted by U.S. helicopters. The North Vietnamese did everything possible to stop the South Vietnamese from escaping, pursuing them with tanks and other armored vehicles. The panic that erupted in some South Vietnamese units was reminiscent of what had been seen earlier from the Ranger deserters at Ranger Base North. Lieutenant Colonel William N. Preachy, who commanded the 158th Aviation Battalion and supported the South Vietnamese during most of Lam Son 719, recalled the harrowing nature of their withdrawal. The ARVN troops would do anything to escape Laos. The healthy would run over the dead and wounded. We would hover just a few feet above, with the crew chief and gunner lying on their bellies to pull people up. If anyone got on the ground, they'd turn the helicopter over. Then there were those who would run and leap onto the shoulders of others, grabbing onto the skids. The helicopters would rise to 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and after 5 or 10 minutes, they'd get tired and let go. I can still see the bodies falling through the sky. The last ARVN troops crossed back into South Vietnam on March 24th, with the operation officially ending on April 6, 1971, 45 days after South Vietnamese forces had first entered Laos. Evaluating Lam Son 719 is challenging. On the day his forces reached Chapone, President Thieu declared Lam 719 the biggest victory ever, a moral, political, and psychological Dien Bien Phu. Similarly, the Nixon administration launched a campaign to persuade the American public that despite the clear evidence to the contrary, the operation had been a success. President Nixon had stated in February that the operation has gone according to plan and that the ARVN was fighting in a superior way. Administration spokespersons referred to the South Vietnamese withdrawal from Laos as simply mobile maneuvering. This was clearly spin, but even after the war, Nixon continued. He insisted that the operation had met its goals, stating in his memoirs, "The net result of Lam Son 719 was a military success but a psychological defeat, largely due to the unfavorable media coverage during the withdrawal." While Nixon's views on the operation can be contested, it's clear that many in the U.S. media reacted strongly against the administration's claims regarding South Vietnamese performance and the operation's outcomes. James McCartney, writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer, noted that the South Vietnamese had developed a new approach to warfare in Laos. They tend to avoid confrontation, retreating from areas when the communists arrive, yet they consistently declare themselves victorious or successful after an operation concludes. Many U.S. military personnel previously criticized the South Vietnamese for their tendency to flee in battles, but now Pentagon spokespeople commend their mobility when they retreat. The Cleveland Plains dealer pushed back against the administration, asserting, "Instead of the military success President Nixon has heralded, it seems the Laos incursion was a defeat that has strengthened Hanoi's confidence." A more balanced report in the Philadelphia Bulletin remarked, "Without our air support and 51 battalions of U.S. troops to hold the line, one can only speculate how much worse things could have been." The North Vietnamese, largely agreeing with the media's negative take, mocked the operation, labeling it the heaviest defeat ever for Nixon and company, truly a fine example of Vietnamization. An impartial view of the Laotian campaign falls somewhere between Nixon's statements and the media's portrayal. Militarily, the outcomes were mixed. Saigon reported 1,160 government troops killed, 4,271 wounded, and 240 missing. However, many in the press, including the Associated Press and Newsweek, questioned these numbers, estimating the actual casualties at 3,800 killed, 5,200 wounded, and 775 missing. According to Z-14 Corps official figures, which aligned more closely with the media reports, Saigon's total casualties came to 9,000 killed, wounded, and captured, with a total casualty rate of nearly 50%. U.S. casualties included 253 killed or missing and 1,149 wounded. In terms of equipment, The U.S. lost 108 helicopters destroyed and 618 damaged, with 20% expected to never fly again. The U.S. Air Force lost 7 fighter bombers, and 4 pilots were killed in action. The ARVN lost 211 trucks, 87 combat vehicles, 54 tanks, 96 artillery pieces, and all combat engineer equipment that had supported the attackers. Allies reported 19,043 enemy killed, along with 1,123 crew served and 3,045 individual weapons captured, as well as 110 tanks, 13 artillery pieces, 270 Molotov trucks, 13,630 tons of munitions, 15 tons of 122mm rockets, 7,010 meters of pipeline, and 1,250 tons of rice destroyed. It's significant to notice that while these results seem impressive, most occurred early in the campaign before the South Vietnamese lost the initiative. Despite the casualties the North Vietnamese suffered and the enemy supplies captured or destroyed, South Vietnamese combat performance was, at best, inconsistent. President Nixon, attempting to put a positive spin on what had been nearly disastrous results, commended the South Vietnamese for performing admirably against the North Vietnamese's best. He stated, "General Abrams says that some ARVN units did not perform well, but 18 out of 22 battalions showed high morale and great confidence, and they are capable of defending themselves, man for man, against the North Vietnamese." However, this view is highly questionable. While some units fought exceptionally well, others, including elite forces, faltered and retreated under heavy pressure from the NVA. The weaknesses of the South Vietnamese were glaring. Once again, the politicized senior leadership posed a significant issue. Although Lieutenant General Lam was the overall ground commander, he was largely disregarded by the commanders of the airborne and marine divisions, both lieutenant generals themselves, who were more accustomed to responding directly to Saigon rather than to a corps commander. They challenged Lam's orders at every turn. While Lam sought support from President Thieu, Thieu refused to reprimand Lam's subordinate commanders, even when their conduct bordered on insubordination, during the thick of the battle. Thieu didn't want to upset the 2 other generals, one of whom led his main anti-coup force, and the other of whom commanded a significant part of his strategic reserve. Once more, political factors took precedence over military needs. Lam wasn't exactly a standout leader. Gen. Bruce Palmer noted after the war that Lam's reputation as a combat commander was only mediocre, but he was seen as a loyal, capable administrator. Before Lam Son 719, Lam had managed to maintain his position as a corps commander thanks to his political savvy and his backing of President Thieu. However, he lacked experience in overseeing large-scale conventional operations. The fierce combat in Laos and the challenges of the mission were far too overwhelming for him. Lieutenant Colonel Darren from the 14th Corps headquarters later reflected on Lam's conduct during the operations, recalling, "I remember seeing him one morning near the end of the operation when things were spiraling in Laos. He was laying back, kind of crucified against his bunker, gazing at the sky with his eyes closed. You could tell he was under immense pressure. Honestly, it seemed like he was just in over his head." Lam's shortcomings were apparent throughout the mission. Brigadier Gen. Sidney B. Berry, who served as assistant commander of the 101st Airborne Division, noted after the operation that the planning and coordination for Lam Son 7119 were unacceptably poor at the corps commander's level. Lam was dreadfully unprepared to handle an operation as large and intricate as Lam Son 7119, yet he wasn't the only one facing challenges. Sadly, for the South Vietnamese, the issues with planning and coordination stretched beyond just the corps commander level. ARVN leaders at all ranks struggled with command and control, especially when it came to coordinating combined arms operations, which included properly integrating infantry, armor, and artillery, as well as effectively deploying reserve forces. General Vian, the chairman of the RVNAF Joint General Staff, summed up the impact of these challenges. "Our 300-vehicle armored force, deployed in unfavorable terrain, was powerless against enemy tanks and unable to support the airborne division in breaking through the enemy encirclement or regaining the initiative." Meanwhile, the enemy's armor proved effective. The situation was aggressive and perilous. The enemy exploited the challenging terrain to set ambushes and surround our strongpoints, ultimately teaming up with infantry to launch assaults and overwhelm them. Our infantry units avoided engaging in maneuvers and didn't utilize their inherent firepower to eliminate the enemy, depending solely on external support. Both the I Corps and division commanders had reserves available, but chose not to deploy them to tackle obstacles and seize back the initiative. Unfortunately, even our available firepower wasn't effectively utilized, especially during the operation's initial month due to poor coordination. The absence of U.S. advisors was notably felt, leading to recurring coordination issues among South Vietnamese forces. Many tasks that ARVN commanders typically relied on their U.S. advisors to handle were neglected or poorly executed. Army Chief of Staff William Westmoreland noted that subordinate ARVN commanders, used to working alongside American advisors, struggled to organize fire support and resupply without them. The top American advisor and the overall ARVN commander were based separately, causing miscommunication. Several senior ARVN leaders faltered, compelling President Thieu to step in and issue orders directly, often without General Abrams' awareness. A major concern for MAF-V was the South Vietnamese inability to coordinate their own fire support, resulting in a heavy reliance on U.S. resources. Both MAX-V and the RVNF Joint General Staff recognized that U.S. air support had been crucial in preventing a complete collapse for the South Vietnamese in Laos. U.S. Army helicopters conducted over 160,000 missions, while tactical aircraft carried out more than 10,000 strikes to support the South Vietnamese forces. This dependence on U.S. air support was alarming, particularly since it would vanish with the withdrawal of American troops. If the ARVN couldn't manage their own fire support, facing the North Vietnamese alone post-withdrawal would be daunting. One of the most significant and enduring consequences of Lam Son 719 was its negative impact on the morale and spirit of South Vietnamese forces. Despite President Thieu's grand statements, the reality on the ground was much different. The retreat from Laos was a clear acknowledgement of defeat. Major William Dabney, a U.S. Marine Corps advisor who coordinated from the air, noted the stark change in the Vietnamese Marines. He said, "These were brave men, well-led, well-supplied, full of spirit and confidence when they went in. But when they came out, they were defeated. They knew they had been beaten, and it showed in their demeanor." During the retreat, many South Vietnamese soldiers were left dead on the battlefield. One ARVN officer reflected on the deep sorrow it caused the families, saying, "This was a terrible trauma for those families who, because of their devotion to honoring the dead and their bonds with the living, faced a life of endless grief and uncertainty. The sentiment in Vietnam would never forget." While Thieu maintained that they had achieved victory, the soldiers and their families were under no illusion about the operation's outcome and felt deeply demoralized by what they perceived as a clear defeat at the hands of the North Vietnamese. To counteract the decline in morale, Thieu took measures including banning U.S. news magazines like Time and Newsweek and several opposition newspapers that highlighted the operation's failures. He also kept the badly impacted airborne and marine divisions stationed in I Corps instead of sending them back to Saigon, preferring they not share their stories about the near catastrophe in Laos. Still, the morale and confidence of South Vietnamese forces had suffered a significant blow. There's no doubt that Lam Son 719 was a defeat for the ARVN and a setback for Vietnamization. However, it did achieve some of its original goals. Lieutenant General Sutherland sent an assessment to Abrams in late March stating, "Lam Son 719 has been costly in terms of U.S. support, but the results so far suggest that, in terms of damage to the enemy, disruption of his planned operations, proof of the effectiveness of Vietnamization, and long-term benefits, it has been an undeniably valuable and productive operation." Sutherland's evaluation might have been somewhat exaggerated, and his views on the effectiveness of Vietnamization are: there's certainly room for discussion, but there's substantial evidence that Lam Son 719 at least temporarily interrupted the NVA buildup in Laos. While South Vietnamese forces faced heavy losses, the North Vietnamese suffered just as much, if not more, with some estimates claiming they lost up to half of the troops involved in this operation. Even if these numbers are on the high side, it's clear that the operation cost the communists significantly in terms of personnel and equipment, resources that might have been used in a forthcoming major NVA offensive against Military Region 1, later in 1971. Therefore, LM-SON 719 played a crucial role in postponing the next significant communist attack. It would take almost a year for North Vietnam to recover from the losses incurred while trying to eliminate South Vietnamese forces along Route 9. This provided a brief but necessary break from NVA pressure for the South Vietnamese and the Vietnamization strategy. As Keith Nolan pointed out in Into Laos, Vietnamization had been tested, had strained but not cracked, and now had continued room to grow. Right after LM-SON 719 ended, President Nixon declared, "Tonight I can report that Vietnamization has succeeded." He then announced an acceleration in the withdrawal of U.S. troops, with an additional 100,000 expected home by November 1971. He assured the public that American involvement in Vietnam was coming to an end, but he wouldn't specify a date for complete withdrawal, saying that doing so would weaken our key leverage to secure the release of American prisoners of war and take away the enemy's strongest motivation to negotiate for an earlier end to the conflict. By the end of 1971, the announced troop withdrawals would leave 184,000 American soldiers still in South Vietnam. In June 1971, Secretary of Defense Laird reported that 90% of combat responsibility had shifted to the RVRV, and 2 months later, he announced that Phase 1 of Vietnamization was complete. This indicated that ground combat duties would now be solely under the RVNF's control. However, despite claims from the administration about the success of LM-SON 719, the operation raised serious concerns regarding Phase 2 of Vietnamization. During this phase, South Vietnamese forces were to establish their air and naval support systems, alongside artillery, logistics, and maintenance frameworks, to replace those that had been provided by the United States since 1965. The duration of this process was uncertain, but LM-SON 719 revealed that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam still had significant steps to take before achieving self-sufficiency in combat. It was understood that as the South Vietnamese aimed for this objective, the United States would need to continue providing combat support, especially air support, which had proven crucial in Laos, while it slowly withdrew its remaining ground troops. General Philip Davidson characterized the 1971 situation by stating that LM-SON 719 highlighted the fact that although Vietnamization had made strides, the South Vietnamese government and military had serious weaknesses that made the ultimate success of this concept likely many years, perhaps even decades, away. Most importantly, the operation underscored the ARVN's complete reliance on U.S. forces.